Hello, class. In this lecture, we'll look at verses 6 through 10 in the first chapter of Galatians. And we have titled this lecture, The Denunciation. And this is very strong language from the Apostle Paul to those churches there in South Galatia. So let's look at verse 6. Paul writes, I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another. Paul moved with great abruptness from the salutation into the body of the epistle. The Thanksgiving section that usually comes at this point in letters in this epistle is omitted in Galatians. Instead of expressing thanks for the Galatians' advance of the gospel, Paul expressed astonishment at their apostasy from it and rebukes their fickleness. The Galatians were not deserting to another gospel, allos, another of the same kind. They were deceived by another, heteros, a gospel of a different kind. Look at verse 7. Only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. Evidently, there was a band of false teachers disseminating their views among the Galatians. Paul leveled two charges against them. They had disturbed the Galatian believers. They had perverted the gospel. These perversions are seen in four areas. They believe in the perfection of the flesh. They believe in the obligatory observance of days, months, seasons, and years. They believe in being justified by the law, the Mosaic law. They believe in mandatory circumcision. Verse 8. But even if we or an angel from heaven, he says, should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. Paul, look at the commentary. Paul indicated that the issue at stake in Galatia was not the messenger, but the message itself. Paul did not ask the Galatians to be loyal to him, rather to the unchanging message of Christ that he had preached to them. Why did Paul mention angels? It may indicate a higher spirituality brought to Galatia by the false teachers. Paul's opponents may have cited the role of angels in the deliverance of the law to give a supernatural enhancement to their own proclamation of a law-observant gospel. So their gospel, the opponents, was law plus the grace plus law. Look at verse 8. But even if we, writes Paul, or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. This is very strong language. The Greek anathema, esto, is translated, he is to be accursed. To be anathematized means more than to be even excommunicated from the church. It was synonymous with anything or anyone delivered over to God's wrath for final judgment, that is, condemnation to hell. Paul did not hesitate to unleash the full fury of his righteous indignation when he was convinced that the integrity of the gospel he preached was at stake. Look at verse number 9. As we have said before, says Paul, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, when I preached it, was implied, when I came through the first time, he is to be accursed. Paul may have repeated the anathema in order to emphasize its severity. So repetition does indicate emphasis. One difference in style between Galatians 1:8 and 1:9. In 1:8, the if clause is followed by a subjunctive verb to emphasize the improbability of Paul proclaiming another gospel. However, in 1:9, the if clause is followed by an indicative verb, not a subjunctive, to indicate the ongoing crisis with the false teacher was indeed a fact. Look at verse 10. Paul gives his motive for ministry. For if am I now seeking the favor of men, he asks, or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. And so he's using a method called diatribe, asking questions to get his point across. Obviously, the false teachers have attacked not only Paul's message, but also his motivation for ministry. Evidently, Paul had been accused of being a flatterer, attempting to win the approval of men. Notice the sarcasm here. Do I now persuade men or God? That is linked to the anathema he had just proclaimed. There was a time Paul did seek to please others before his conversion to Christ. However, since his conversion, Paul understood that serving Christ and pleasing humanity were mutually exclusive alternatives. And that concludes this lecture. The source for the lecture came from Donald Campbell, contribution of Galatians in the Bible Knowledge Commentary. Also from Timothy George, his commentary, New American Commentary on Galatians, and also from Arnold Fruchtenbaum's work, Faith Alone, the Condition of Our Salvation. And that concludes this lecture.